I believe that it is part of my work in the world to try to heal American culture from this central trauma that is destroying us. Now, how did I do that? Well, it's been complicated. But I started in my church. I was a pastor, as I said. I thought I have to begin with my local congregation. How do I do this? How do I work this out in a local congregation of mostly educated social elites in a town with only an 18% minority population? How do I do this in a world where white supremacy doesn't even seem to be real, and the white academic liberalism around me is so smug and assumes that it's not in any way implicated in all this? How do I do that? Well, what I did is I remembered, I began to think, all right, what are the things that allowed white supremacy to exist? Let me understand those, and then I'll try to take those three on, okay? And here's what they are: ignorance, extraction, and control. Those three things are what allows white supremacy to exist: ignorance, extraction, and control. Ignorance, that is to say, I realized that many of my beloved people had no idea about the history of white supremacy in the United States. They thought that was a group of people who were off in the woods in North Carolina somewhere doing weird stuff. They had no idea of the social and economic and housing and medical, and none of it. And I realized, oh, if ignorance is the issue, then I need to do education, because I understood that my congregation knew more about the church in Iran than they do about the black church in their own town. And tell me if that is not universally the case. And so I began to just educate my people. I began to I taught a class on the history of the black church. I used sermon illustrations predominantly from African American communities. I talked about and quoted and asked my people to read African American theologians. I knew that they could tell me more 17th century English theologians than living African American theologians. And I bet that's true of 95% of the people in the room. And that's just how it works. The whole thing of white supremacy was not for white people to hate black people. It was for us to ignore them, to not see them, to not know anything about them. And so I began to do the work of education. And I began to talk about our role as a denomination in the history of America. What about extraction? Well, I realized that white supremacy was basically a form of extraction, that we took things that did not belong to us, that we took out of communities. And African American communities are decimated across the United States precisely for these reasons. And the history of this is incontrovertible. I mean, it's really beyond controversy at this point. So what do we do as a church? Well, the antidote to extraction is investment. And we began to think about our local missions budget as almost a repair fund, as a reinvestment fund in the African American community in our city. So, meeting ignorance with education, extraction with investment. And the last part is control. The way white supremacy continues is that white people are always in control of institutions. We're always the ones setting the table. We're always the ones setting the terms. We write the policy manuals. This is true, broadly speaking. And I realized that in order for me in my own life to overcome that I needed to meet that with renunciation. To meet control with renunciation. And I knew that there was no way that minority voices would ever be able to lead at my church as long as I was there. And so I resigned. And I still go to our church. And it's wonderful. And people don't treat me as like the real pastor. People don't even talk to me about church stuff. The elders were awesome. They said, we just want to let these folks be Christian people here. Can you just leave them alone? And the church did, which is amazing. And they hired a Korean, and they offered the senior pastor job to an African American but they did that around August 12th of last year. I'm not sure if you remember what was happening in Charlottesville around August 12th last year. Namely, the Klan was walking through our town with torches, and a woman was killed. And so the African American pastor said, I'm not really ready to bring my family into this. So he said no. So they've been in this search process. But I knew that I had to meet ignorance with education, extraction with investment, and control with renunciation. And that is how I began to work this out in the church. And it was very confusing for me. It was very confusing for my people. Like, why is he leaving? We don't understand. And I didn't fully understand. But I understood that as long as I was standing there, that other people who needed to stand there couldn't be there.